Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that you might not think about every day, and that's hantavirus. But whether you're somebody who spends a lot of time outdoors, or even if you're just somebody who really likes to keep their home nice and clean and tidy, understanding this virus is actually really important.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think hantavirus is one of those things that really highlights how, even with all of our modern advancements, we really are still part of this larger ecosystem.
Mhm.
And sometimes those interactions can have some pretty serious consequences for us.
Okay, so you've definitely piqued my interest already.
Yeah.
So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. When we say hantavirus, what exactly are we talking about?
So hantavirus is actually a family of viruses, and they're carried primarily by rodents. So we're talking like mice and rats in particular. And these viruses can cause two main types of diseases in humans. So we have hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, which you'll often hear called HPS, and then there's hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, which is also known as HFRS. And while HPS is more common here in the Americas, HFRS is actually more prevalent over in Asia and Europe.
Wow, so two different diseases with different global distributions. That's pretty fascinating. Can you maybe break those two diseases down for us a little bit more, like what makes them unique?
Sure, yeah. So both HPS and HFRS, they affect the body in different ways. So HPS primarily attacks the lungs, and it actually causes them to fill with fluid. And that can lead to some really serious respiratory distress. Now, HFRS, on the other hand, it impacts the kidneys more, and that can actually lead to some bleeding disorders as well. And the symptoms and the severity of both of these diseases can vary depending on the specific strain of the virus that you're dealing with.
Gotcha. So understanding those differences between those two is really important, not only for diagnosis, but also for treatment. So I'm curious, how long has hantavirus been around? Was this something that scientists have always been aware of?
Well, it's interesting because hantavirus, it wasn't always, a household name or anything like that. Although it was first identified back in the 1950s during the Korean War, it really didn't grab like major public attention until 1993. And there was this huge outbreak in the Four Corners region of the United States. And from that event, scientists learned a lot more, including identifying the deer mouse as that primary carrier of the Cinnumbra virus. And that's what causes HPS here in North America.
So relatively recent in terms of like widespread awareness. That 1993 outbreak must have been pretty alarming, I would imagine. What kind of impact did it have on our understanding of the virus?
Oh, it was a turning point for sure. It really spurred a huge increase in research and public health efforts. And they were really focused on understanding how this virus spreads, how to diagnose it, and most importantly, how to prevent infections. Before that outbreak, we knew very little about the virus and its potential to cause such severe illness.
Yeah, it's amazing how a single event like that can really change the trajectory of scientific understanding. But let's talk a little bit about how hantavirus actually spreads, because I think a lot of people, when they hear, a virus, they automatically think, oh, it's going to be like the flu or a cold, something that spreads through the air from person to person. Is that the case here?
That's a common misconception, but thankfully, no. Unlike a lot of those other respiratory viruses, hantavirus, it's not spread through person-to-person contact. The primary mode of transmission is actually through contact with rodent droppings, urine, or saliva.
Okay, so it's not so much about avoiding the rodents themselves. It's about avoiding their leavings, I
Huh?
guess.
Yeah, exactly. You can become infected by inhaling dust that's contaminated with that rodent waste, or even by touching contaminated surfaces and then, touching your face, your eyes, your nose, or your mouth.
Right. So, let's say you're in a situation like you're cleaning out an old shed or an attic and it's dusty. Maybe it's got that musty smell. Could that be a risky situation?
Oh, absolutely. Those are prime environments where, rodents may have nested and left behind contaminated droppings. So it's really important to be extra cautious when you're cleaning those kinds of areas.
Good to know. So avoiding that direct contact with rodent waste seems like it's really crucial. Are there any other ways that somebody could contract hantavirus?
Yeah, so while it's less common, rodent bites can also transmit the virus. So if you do happen to get bitten by a rodent, it's definitely a reason to seek medical attention.
Okay, adding avoid rodent bites to my to-do list. But seriously, this is all really important information. Now that we know a little bit more about how it spreads, let's shift gears and talk about the symptoms, because if somebody thinks that they might have been exposed to hantavirus, what are some things that they should be looking out for?
Yeah, so this is where things get a little bit tricky because the initial symptoms of hantavirus, they can actually mimic the flu. You might have a fever, fatigue, muscle aches, especially in your thighs, hips, and back, headaches, dizziness. You might even experience some nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. So pretty general symptoms, right?
Yeah, I can definitely see how it would be easy to just kind of brush those off as, oh, I'm just coming down with something, especially if you don't suspect that you've had any contact with rodents.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to think about your recent environment. Have you been cleaning out that old shed we were talking about? Working in a barn or a dusty basement? Spending time in areas where those rodents might be present? If so, and you start to experience those flu-like symptoms, it's really crucial to be aware that it could potentially be hantavirus.
So those early symptoms are kind of like a warning flag, especially when you combine them with that potential rodent contact. But what happens if the hantavirus progresses? Does it just feel like a really, really bad case of the flu, or?
Unfortunately, no. Things can actually take a much more serious turn at that point. As the virus progresses, you might start to experience shortness of breath. You might have a persistent cough. And those are telltale signs of HPS, or that hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. It's important to understand that HPS can be life-threatening, and early detection is absolutely crucial.
Okay, so that's a pretty serious shift there. Shortness of breath, coughing. Those sound like kind of red alert symptoms.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And if you suspect that you've been exposed to hantavirus and you're experiencing those more severe symptoms, you need to seek immediate medical attention. Don't wait to see if it gets better on its own.
Wow. This is a lot to take in. And I'm sure there are some listeners out there who might be feeling a little bit concerned after hearing all of this.
Yeah.
But before we dive into any prevention strategies, I think it's important to just take a moment and kind of let this information sink in.
You're right. It's important to process this information and understand the potential risks. But the good news is that armed with this knowledge, we can actually take steps to protect ourselves and minimize those risks.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to do next. Stay tuned, folks, because prevention is where we really empower ourselves to stay safe. Okay, so we're back. And now we're going to get into the really empowering part of this conversation, which is all about prevention. Because like you said, knowing how to protect ourselves can make all the difference in the world. So where do we even start? What are some of the golden rules for keeping those hantavirus risks as low as possible?
Well, it really all comes down to minimizing our contact with those rodent droppings, urine and saliva. And thankfully, there are a lot of really practical steps we can take to do just that, both in our homes and also when we're out, enjoying nature.
Okay, so let's tackle the home front first.
Hmm.
I'm picturing, the determined homeowner ready to kind of fortify their house against any rodent invaders. What's our game plan?
I love that analogy. Think of it like building a fortress. First, we need to seal up any cracks or holes, no matter how small they seem, because those crafty little critters can really squeeze through some pretty tiny spaces. So
Okay.
think about your foundation walls around pipes and vents. Those are all prime entry points for
Oh,
rodents.
yeah, I can definitely picture those old cartoons, where the mouse can fit through the tiniest little hole in the wall. So we're talking weather stripping, caulk, steel wool, anything we can use to block those entry points.
You got it. And don't forget about doors and windows, too. Make sure they close tightly. And you can even add things like door sweeps or brush strips to seal any gaps.
Okay, fortress walls, check. What about our food supply? I know mice and rats, they're always on the hunt for a tasty snack. So is my pantry basically like a rodent buffet?
Well, it could be if you're not careful. Proper food storage is absolutely essential. So make sure you're storing all of your food, including pet food, in airtight containers. Those cardboard boxes and flimsy bags, they're basically like an open invitation for a rodent feast.
Right, well, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for our unwanted guests. So we've got a secure fortress, we've got our food supply well guarded. What else can we do to kind of discourage those rodents from, wanting to set up shop in our homes?
Well, this one might seem simple, but it's so important. Cleanliness, my friend. Cleanliness. Regular cleaning, especially in areas like your kitchen, basements, attics, garages, that can go a long way in deterring rodents. Because remember, they love those undisturbed, cluttered spaces where they can build their nests and hide out.
Got it. So decluttering, keeping things tidy, and, regularly cleaning even those nooks and crannies that we often forget about. But what if, or now despite our best efforts, we do find some evidence of those unwelcome visitors?
Right.
What's the protocol for cleaning an area that might be contaminated?
That is an excellent question. And this is where those gloves and masks that we talked about earlier become super important. Anytime you're cleaning an area where there might be, rodent droppings, urine, or nests, you really want to make sure you're protecting yourself.
Gloves and masks, check. But I have to admit my instinct would be to grab the strongest disinfectant I can find and just go to town. Is that the right approach?
That's a common mistake, and here's why. Sweeping or vacuuming is actually not recommended when you're dealing with potential hantavirus contamination.
Really? Why not? I mean, isn't that kind of standard cleaning procedure?
Well, the problem is that sweeping and vacuuming can actually aerosolize those tiny particles of rodent waste and basically launch them into the air where they can be much more easily inhaled. And remember, inhaling that contaminated dust is a primary way that the virus spreads.
Oh, wow. That makes perfect sense. So what is the recommended cleaning method? What's the safest way to handle this?
We're going to go the wet route. So before you even start, open those windows and doors, ventilate the area, fresh air is your friend. Then you're going to mix up a disinfectant solution. You can use a bleach solution, about 1 part bleach to 10 parts water, or you can use a commercial disinfectant that's specifically labeled to kill hantavirus. Some common brands that are really effective are Clorox and Lysol.
Okay, so diluted bleach or hantavirus-specific disinfectant, got it.
Mhm.
I'm wearing my gloves. I've got my mask on. The area's well ventilated. I've got my cleaning solution. What's next?
Think damp, not drenched. So thoroughly wet down any areas that have potential contamination before you wipe or mop them up. This helps to prevent those contaminated particles from becoming airborne.
So no frantic scrubbing, just a controlled, damp cleaning process. And what about those cleaning materials afterwards?
Good question. You want to double bag those in plastic bags and dispose of them properly according to your local waste disposal guidelines. And of course, even though you were wearing gloves, it's always a good idea to wash your hands really thoroughly with soap and water after you're done cleaning.
Okay, I'm feeling much more prepared to tackle any indoor rodent situations now. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about outdoor safety. Because what if, we're out camping or hiking or just spending time in nature where those, cute but potentially risky rodents might be lurking? What kind of precautions should we be taking then?
Yeah, that's a great point because all of those precautions we talked about, they're going to look a little different in an outdoor setting.
Right, fortress building and bleach solutions aren't exactly practical in the wilderness.
Exactly. But there's still plenty of things we can do to minimize our risk while we're enjoying the great outdoors. So first and foremost, try to avoid areas where rodents are likely to be nesting or burrowing. Like wood piles, brush piles, or tall, grassy areas. If you're camping, choose a campsite that's been cleared and maintained.
Makes sense. I mean, those areas are basically like rodent playgrounds. But what about those adorable chipmunks and squirrels that always seem to pop up around campsites? Are they a concern when it comes to hantavirus?
Well, chipmunks and squirrels can carry other diseases, but they're not considered significant carriers of hantavirus. The real culprits that we're focusing on here are deer mice, white-footed mice, cotton rats, and rice rats.
Okay, so chipmunks and squirrels get a pass, but we're still keeping an eye out for those other rodents. What else can we do to stay safe while we're camping or hiking?
When you're setting up your camp, try to choose a spot that's on higher ground, because rodents tend to prefer those lower-lying areas.
Elevated campsite check. What about food storage? Those little
Wow.
bear-shaped canisters, those aren't just for bears, are they?
Absolutely not. Those sturdy, rodent-proof containers are your best friend when it comes to storing food and garbage outdoors. Don't leave anything out in the open that might tempt those little critters. And if you're sleeping in a tent, make sure those zippers are closed securely. And you might even consider using a tent with a solid floor to prevent those rodents from burrowing underneath.
Wow, so many practical tips. I'm really starting to see how, being informed can empower us to really enjoy nature safely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. Everything from rodent-proofing our homes to staying vigilant when we're out in the wilderness. I know I'm feeling way more informed and way less intimidated by hantavirus now, but I bet some of our listeners might still have some questions.
Oh, for sure. It's totally natural to have questions, especially when you're dealing with something like this.
Right. Okay. So first one that comes to mind, this is probably a really common one. If I see a rodent in my house, does that automatically mean that I'm at risk for hantavirus? Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is not necessarily. Just because you see a rodent doesn't automatically mean that it's carrying hantavirus. Remember, it's the contact with the droppings, the urine, or the saliva that really poses that risk.
Gotcha. So seeing a rodent is more of a sign that we need to maybe, step up those rodent proofing measures and be extra vigilant about that potential for contamination.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to check your defenses, make sure those fortress walls are still holding strong.
Okay, that makes sense. Another question that comes to mind, especially for all of our pet owners out there, are our furry friends at risk for hantavirus, and could they potentially spread it to us?
Another great question. And the good news is that cats and dogs, they're generally not considered high-risk carriers of hantavirus.
Phew, that's a relief for a lot of worried pet parents out there.
It is, but it's still a good idea to keep your pets away from areas where those rodents might be present. And as always, good hygiene practices like washing your hands after you play with your pets or handle them.
Right? Basic hygiene is always a good idea. Okay, last question. This one's about those ultrasonic rodent repellents. Do those things actually work? Are they a reliable way to keep the rodents away?
Ah, the age-old question.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, there's not a ton of scientific evidence to support the effectiveness of those ultrasonic repellents. Rodents can actually adapt to those sounds pretty quickly, and they might not be a reliable solution for that long-term rodent control.
So sticking with those tried and true rodent-proofing strategies that we talked about earlier is going to be our best bet.
Exactly. Those physical barriers, proper sanitation, and those good hygiene practices, those are your most effective weapons in the fight against those rodents and all of the risks that they can pose.
Awesome. Well, I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about hantavirus, what it is, how it spreads, how we can protect ourselves. Like I said, I feel way more informed and way less worried now.
I love to hear that. Remember, knowledge is power, and now you've got the power to make those informed decisions and take those steps to stay safe.
Absolutely. So before we sign off, any final words of wisdom for our listeners? What's like the big takeaway you want them to remember from this whole conversation?
Well, here's something to think about. Rodents are a really common part of our environment, and being mindful of their presence and taking those simple precautions that we talked about. It's not just about protecting yourself from hantavirus, it's about, being smart and taking care of your overall health and well-being.
That's such a great point. It's all about respecting the natural world and understanding how we can coexist safely.
Exactly. We're all interconnected, and understanding those connections is really the key to living healthier lives.
Well said. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into hantavirus and that it's been informative and empowering for you. Now go forth and spread the knowledge, not the virus.
And remember, if you have any lingering questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to your healthcare provider or a trusted source of information.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.